And now we are technically ahead of schedule, but since the audience is already here, I think maybe we don't have to wait for 10 o'clock. We can move on to our first keynote lecture. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Markham Geller from the University College London. He teaches and he has probably shaped the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies there. He is an expert on the ancient Near East and has written very many important books and articles about the area, particularly on the history of science and particularly medicine in the period. I have read his book about ancient Babylonian medicine, which, although I have no medical background, was wonderfully interesting to me, and I recommend it to everyone interested on the subject. And Professor Geller is going to be giving a talk about some very interesting points of touch between law and medicine in the ancient Near East. I'm going to be sharing the presentation now, and you just tell me if you can see it, first of all, and then tell me when to move the slides. Does it work?
Not yet. Ah, it's working.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay.
Professor Geller,
Thank
please
you,
go
Nina.
ahead.
So, dobar den. As govorim malko bolgarski, but I don't speak Serbian, so I'll carry on in English. And I want to say how pleased I am to be here. This is my very first visit to Belgrade. And of course, I would have much preferred to be there in person, perhaps on a future occasion. So I was very interested in the comments of all of the speakers introducing today's talk. So the information from Roman law compared to the kind of information I'm going to give you, to me, seems very modern. And of course, I'm going to give you a very different view of Hammurabi than what we just heard from our colleague. And I think that, but I'm willing to, I hope that we can have a discussion about this information, because I don't know very much about law, and I'm assuming that you don't know very much about Mesopotamia. So it would be very nice if we have a sort of approaching some of these problems from two very different directions, and we have a chance to really discuss them, not just hearing just what I have to say, but I also want to hear what you have to say about these issues and these topics. Now we can go to the next screen. I hope it's big enough to read the texts here. Now, what I'm going to talk about is Hammurabi. So we're going back to 1800 BCE. Can you make it a bit larger? All right, very good. Now, the world it's, of course, the status of law is very different in 1800 BCE than it was in the Roman period. So we can't really expect that the law is going to be same, but we can expect surprisingly similar themes, because legal problems were the same, more or less. It's just that the question is what strategies for dealing with law and solutions were different. But we have to understand that this is Hammurabi's law code. If you've been to the Louvre and you've seen the stela, you see it's a very impressive, very high, imposing monument. It's a couple of meters high, and nobody was really expected to read this law code on this stele. But the Code of Hammurabi was the most popular or commonly copied text in the ancient scribal school curriculum. There's no other text that has more copies than Hammurabi's code. And this goes on for the next 2,000 years after Hammurabi. These poor school children are sitting and copying out, and in order to learn the language, they're copying out these laws from Hammurabi's code, which is exactly the same textbook that we use today when we study this language, Akkadian. We always start the first year Akkadian with Hammurabi's code because the language is so clear and so nicely laid out. So we're not just talking about law that was a law code that was developed in 1800 BCE. It continued to have enormous amount of popular and intellectual influence for the next 2 millennia, and that's very important. But at the other hand, it's not really the law that was practiced in the courtrooms. So in the courts, you have common law. That means, well, and you know more about this than I do. You can enlighten me on the subject. But as far as I understand it, no judge, we have lots and lots of court cases from Mesopotamia. We have records of court cases. We have records of trials. We have all kinds of interesting legal information. Huh? We never have a judge saying, I'm ruling this way because of law 32 of Hammurabi's code. Huh? I think I can remember one instance where Hammurabi's code is referred to in a legal case, but that's generally not the case. So this is not law as it was practiced. What we're dealing with is theory of law, legal theory. This is Hammurabi as king, who's inherited earlier law codes from his predecessors. It didn't just invent everything himself, but he's formulated these laws to prove to the gods what a good ruler he is, how well ordered his society is, how wonderfully things operate in principle. But it means that we're not supposed to take everything literally at face value. These are legal ideals. Now, how this compares with Justinian would be a very interesting matter of study, in terms of the theory behind the law in the Codex. So I would like to hear from you what you might think about that in terms of how Justinian's code is also thought of in terms of legal theory, or is it supposed to be cases? Now, I think in Hammurabi there used to be two ideas. There used to be the idea that these laws were based on actual cases that were then included into a law code. I don't think that's right. I think we'll see that these aren't really realistic, these laws, but the idea is to present a kind of legal theory. And the way you present legal theory, can you go back to the opening slide, Nina? Just the beginning, just the one before this, is if P then Q. So this is a very, very strict formulation that we're going to see throughout Hammurabi's code. These are propositions. If such and such is the case, then such and such should be the case. And we're going to find that this legal formulation, if P then Q, was then applied to all kinds of other academic disciplines, including medicine, but very often with omens and divination, and other kinds of many, many other kinds of applications. This legal formulation became the standard scientific formulation for the next 2 millennia, and it was used everywhere, and we'll see other examples of it. Now, let's look first at this law that I have in front of you, law number 2. Now, this is an example of something which I think is purely theoretical. So someone brings an accusation against someone, usually for witchcraft. Now, who are the witches? We don't know who the witches are. Witches are always anonymous. So someone is accused of being witchcraft. What do? You take them down to the river, and he has a kind of ordeal. So if he sinks, right, then that means he's guilty. He didn't survive the ordeal. He can't swim. If, however, the river proves he's not guilty, that means he survives this ordeal of being thrown into the river. Then the person who accused him of being a witch, he should be put to death. And he takes possession of the house of the accuser. So for me, this is all entirely a theoretical proposition about false accusations in a situation that is hardly ever likely to occur, because it's very difficult to accuse anyone. And of course, the text is telling us that if you accuse someone of witchcraft, you better be sure of your accusation, of your grounds, because otherwise it's all going to rebound badly on you. So one of the ideas of this is that it discourages people from making these kinds of nonsensical accusations against other people, because it's a dangerous thing to do. But the whole basis of this law, it's right at the beginning of Hammurabi's code, law number 2, doesn't inspire confidence that we're talking about real life situations here. This is theoretical. These are theoretical situations of something that might occur in very unusual circumstances. Of course, the idea of the river ordeal is interesting. The idea of an ordeal, someone who's accused of something, because it occurs in the Bible. Does anybody remember where in the Bible this might occur? Anybody have any idea? It's a very interesting case in the Bible. Any legal historians reading the Bible? Please, you can perhaps put an answer in the chat. All right. Remember the story in the Bible about the adulterous wife? The wife who's accused of adultery by her husband. Again, it's a very ambiguous kind of thing. The husband is suspicious that his wife has been unfaithful, so she has to go through an ordeal. She has to swallow a cup full of ashes from a sacrificed red heifer, and if she's guilty, she'll die, and if she's innocent, of course, then everything will be fine, and she'll have children, and her husband will be very happy that she wasn't unfaithful. Of course, now who's this trial? Who is this really for in terms of realistic, from our point of view, modern realistic view? This trial is very important for the husband, not for the wife, because it's to inspire confidence, the husband's confidence in his wife that she wasn't unfaithful. So she survives this ordeal, which she probably will do if it's only just ashes in water. Then the husband won't be suspicious of her anymore. So there is a kind of psychology behind this law, a human psychology behind this law that comes close to what we see in medicine, the use of psychology also in medical circumstances. Reducing anxiety, reducing suspicion, reducing fear of your neighbors. These are a part, I think, of what's behind this kind of logic of the law codes. Okay, let's look at the next slide. As long as nobody, please, you're welcome to interrupt if you have questions. Because remember, I'm not familiar with all the legal ramifications, so you may have thoughts that you would like to contribute here. Now, sometimes laws are very specific about medical situations, like this one. If a man, and we'll come back to what this word means, a man purchases a slave or slave woman, and within a month, that slave develops epilepsy. It's a disease called Bennu, which we think, now, it's not the modern epilepsy, petit mal, petit grand mal, that we diagnose today with laboratory tests and blood tests and everything else that we use today. They had none of that. So this is really any kind of an illness where someone has a seizure and falls down. So it doesn't necessarily mean, we call it epilepsy, but it doesn't necessarily mean epilepsy. And someone purchases a slave and the slave develops seizures for whatever reason. Is he allowed to return this as damaged goods? So in this case, the law seems to be pretty clear. The buyer has to buy back the slave because a slave is property, like in Roman law, I think. So in that case, there's some interesting similarities here. Now let's see what happens in the next case, Nina. This is a woman, and he's married a woman, and she has a disease called labum, which is probably a kind of fever. We're not sure. Infectious disease of some kind. COVID. All right. And he decides to marry another woman, right? But he's not allowed to divorce her. if he marries her and she gets chronically sick, or seriously ill. She still, even if he remarries, she still has to keep residing in his house, and he has to continue to support her. So if he marries a woman and she gets sick, you're not allowed to just simply divorce her on those grounds. So this is a bit like what develops later on in the marriage ceremony when we say, till death do us part. So this is so illness was not grounds for divorce, and that's an interesting kind of legal concept, which probably has ramifications in Roman law and other things that you'll know much more about than I do. But this is a very interesting, because it's 1800 BC, so it's setting this legal principle at a very early stage of legal history. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Now, this is about the surgeon. Right? Now, this is going to surprise everyone, because the penalties have to do with the status of the patient. And that's a very surprising thing. And this changes over time. This is very typical of Hammurabi's code. It doesn't necessarily carry through for the rest of Mesopotamian history in the later periods. But it's a very important principle in Hammurabi's code that penalties are tailored to the social status of the victim. Now, we'll come back to this in a minute. So the first law here these all start off, you see on the left, shuma. Shuma means if. And normally these things start off with shuma awilum, if a man. But in this case, we have it as shuma asum. This is the physician. Now, a physician, it's a very interesting thing that Hammurabi's code concentrates on the role of the physician in his legal matters, as we'll see. So a physician is a kind of, he's not just a physician, he's a sort of apotheke as well. He's an apothecary. He's also the one who prepares the drugs. But what's interesting about the way health was delivered in ancient Mesopotamia was that the physician was the one who didn't need to have a good bedside manner, because he didn't visit the sick patient at home. The patient was visited by a different medical practitioner called the ashipu. And the ashipu we normally think of as an exorcist. An ashipu specializes in magic and incantations. And the asum was the one who actually prepared the drugs and the medication, prepared the treatments, a bit like an apothecary. And he probably also did some other basic kind of treatments. So there was a divided health system between the ashipu, the priest, an incantation priest, and the asu, who is the physician. Now, why is that important? Well, there are a couple of reasons why that's important. One is a question of status. So an ashipum belonged to a temple. So that means he was rich. Priests were rich because temples were very rich, and they received a huge amount of income, not just from people donating, making donations to the temple, to the gods, but they had temple lands. They had lots of income from all kinds of sources. Temples were major industrial institutions in an ancient city. They really affected the economy of a city, and the priests were themselves rich. Remember this kind of, even this sort of European idea of fat like a priest, because priests were even in the Middle Ages. This is the image of the priest. Was very fat. He was well fed. The asum, the physician, was a private enterprise person. He's an entrepreneur. he was the one who had maybe sat on a carpet on the street and sold his drugs, or maybe had a little shop someplace. We don't know, and sold his drugs. He didn't have the status of a priest. He didn't have any separate monthly income, a permanent income. So he was really dependent upon the money he received from seeing patients. Now, what's interesting about Hammurabi's code is that in Hammurabi's period, we have a lot of information about the Ashipu. So, like a book that I just received this week called Akkadian Magic Literature. So these are incantations from the period of Hammurabi, an entire book. And this is just folk magic. There's other books full of all kinds of much more formal magic. So all of this textual material comes from the Ashipu, the exorcists. We're very well informed about what they were doing. We have almost nothing from the Asum from this period. Very, very few texts, only a handful of texts about pure medicine, about how the drugs are mixed and given to the patient for various diseases. So the situation changes as time goes on. We get much, much more medical information. But in the time of Hammurabi, it's very interesting because we have very little information about the Asum and a lot of information about the Ashipu, but the Ashipu is not mentioned. There's not a single reference to him in the Code of Hammurabi. And the question is why that is. And I think that one of the reasons might be is because the Ashipu belonged to the temple, and the temple was a kind of separate institution, not controlled by the king. It was very autonomous. The priests were answerable not to the king so much as to the gods, and they had their own hierarchy of authorities. So the Hammurabi's code doesn't really regulate what goes on in the temples. It's very secular law that has to do with civil law, not religious law. And that is very important distinction that we make, because you can even see this distinction in the Bible, in the 5 books of in the books of Moses, where there's a real distinction you can see in the Bible between laws that we could say is civil law, dealing with individuals, private individuals dealing with each other, even in terms of money, etc., and transactions, or laws dealing with the temple and the cult and the sacrifices. They're very separate, even in the Bible. And I think this was one of the characteristics of law from the ancient Near East. This is why Hammurabi doesn't mention the Ashipu, because it's not of interest to civil law what the Ashipu does. That's the temple. They do what they do. Where the Asum is very much of interest. What happens here, because he's a private businessman, he's taking money for his services, and that has to be regulated by courts and by the king and by the laws. So health, then, the provisions about health are really affected by this division between, say, what we would call church and state. Now, what's interesting, though, is these descriptions about medicine in Hammurabi's code, on the other hand, these descriptions are not written by doctors. These are written by lawyers. And lawyers don't necessarily know what goes on in the doctor's surgery. So that's why we also get a bit of exaggeration and hyperbole and things which are not really well understood about medicine being incorporated into Hammurabi's code. And we'll see examples of that here. So we start off with this law, 215. Please stop if you have questions. Is there any questions in the chat or anything, Nina, that I need to address? Anyway, you can always put a question in the chat if you want, and Nina can stop me. So please. All right. So please, I don't mind being interrupted with questions. So really, instead of just all questions at the end. So please feel free to interrupt. So this law is about the surgeon performing surgery with a scalpel. Now, let me say that we have almost no texts from the ancient world dealing with surgery. There's a famous papyrus from Egypt called the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus. So we think, aha, these Egyptians, they were cutting open their mummies and cutting open human bodies. They must know a lot about what goes on inside the human body. The answer is that's not correct. Because the people who did the actual mummies and cut open the bodies, these were people who would be, these were mortuary specialists. This was a very low grade profession. These are people like today working with dead bodies in a mortuary. They're not doctors, and the doctors are, it's a very high status profession, would not go to these mortuary mummy people to ask them about what goes on in the human body. So I don't think there were conversations between the doctors in Egypt and the people who were cutting open the mummies and mummifying people. And the second thing is that the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus is really only about skin problems. You're not cutting open bodies and taking out an appendix or doing major internal surgeries. It's not really it's really just very minor kind of surgery, usually on the skin, or maybe wounds, or perhaps broken bones, and even that's not clear. So surgery was not practiced. It was practiced, but it wasn't recorded because a surgeon was like a carpenter or a stonemason. This was handwork. This wasn't medicine. Medicine is something that you have, it's intellectual, it's a discipline, it's a science. You write prescriptions, you study plants, you study drugs. This is a very different kind of, the concept of medicine, even in the Greek medicine, is mostly about the idea of how to know a disease, how to diagnose disease, how to understand disease. Surgery is just like building a wall. It's handwork. And we don't have manuals of carpentry from the ancient world. You go, if you want to be a carpenter, you become an apprentice to a carpenter and you learn how to be a carpenter. So surgery was a very low class profession in the ancient world. It had a very low status, like in medieval Europe. We have the barber surgeon. The barber was probably the surgeon, even in the ancient world. So here we have in Hammurabi's code a very strange law that the physician is operating with a scalpel to heal a person by opening someone's temple and putting this scalpel into the person's eye in order to make him or her see better. Now, and for this, he gets 10 shekels of silver as his fee. Now, this needs a little bit of explaining. We have lots and lots of information about eye diseases and eye problems. We never get a single reference to anyone sticking needles or scalpels into anybody's eye or eye surgery in any medical text or anywhere in the medical literature. We get absolute silence, nothing like this. So there are people who studied this passage and say, well, this is obviously somebody that has a cataract. So you have a filmy lens, and you take a needle and you stick it into the eye, and it pushes back the filmy lens, and so more light gets into the eye. Well, maybe. It's not impossible. But on the other hand, we have no evidence of this taking place at all, and it's very strange that it's only this kind of surgery is mentioned in Hammurabi's code. Now, he's getting paid 10 shekels of silver if the physician does this. That's a lot of money. You can buy a lot for 10 shekels of silver in Hammurabi's Babylon in 1800. It's probably you could probably buy a slave for that. So this tells us a couple of interesting things. It tells us something about the fact that physicians could charge a lot of money, but that's because the physician wasn't dealing with little ailments like a sore throat or a headache. You didn't go to a asum if you had something minor. You went there if you were really something serious was wrong with you. You were going blind, or you were dying. And if he saves your life, then it's worth a lot of money. What is the price of a human life? And I think that's really the point here, that this is a Wheelam who's really able to heal someone or cure someone. And so this shows that medicine in this time is what we call critical medicine. It's someone's life is in danger and the asum is being called. And of course, at that time, without antibiotics and other things, people were in danger. And so being healed was, or cured by a doctor was a major event. It wasn't just a minor event. And it was major in the sense that it should be controlled by law. And this is the only time we ever hear of how much a physician is allowed to charge for his services. We never get another word about this for the next 2,000 years. We don't have any receipts. We don't have any invoices. We don't have any letters saying I went to the doctor and I paid him so much money. It's complete silence on the subject. And although we have lots and lots of thousands and thousands of cuneiform tablets with information about transactions, buying and selling and loans, etc. Lots and lots, buying a sheep, buying goats, everything. All kinds of transactions, never about the doctor. So that is it's an interesting thing to have this here in Hammurabi's code. But the next law is also interesting. Number 216. You see this one, it says, if the patient is a member of the commoner class. And the word for commoner class is mushkenu. Now, any of you know French will know that the word miskin in French, it's a common word in many, many languages. Anybody know what it means? A miskin is someone who's an unfortunate person, someone who's had bad luck, We have this, it's in many languages, this is a very common word, and it's all these words go back to this Hammurabi's term mushkenum. And we're not sure exactly what it means. They call it a commoner, but what we know is that it's between the man Awilum, who's probably a landowning person, a gentleman, and the third category, who's the slave. So whoever this mushkenum is, he's not a landowner, he's not a member of the gentry, he's not an aristocrat, and he's not a slave. So he's somewhere in the middle. Maybe he was a shopkeeper, maybe he was a craftsman. It's interesting how this word took on this meaning of someone who's an unfortunate or a low life, all kinds of meanings in many different languages. But so if the gentleman pays 10 shekels for being healed, the mushkenum only has to pay 5 shekels, and the slave only has to, owner of a slave only has to pay 2 shekels. So then that's the question. What is the value of a human life? And it's dependent upon the social status of the person involved. It's very surprising for us, but it's also very revealing, this kind of view of the world, because it's very clear. It's not ambiguous. We may think this in our own world without stating it like this. The society has these distinctions built into it, but it's never very clearly stated. Here, it's very clearly stated. This is what a person's worth. Mushkenum is worth half the price, half the value of an awilum, and the slave is even much less than that. So let's go on to the next slide, if we can. My wife just brought me coffee. One of the advantages of an online lecture. Please stop if you have questions. I really don't mind being interrupted. Huh? Now, what happens if things go wrong? This is what our colleague, Professor Kavich, was that his name, who spoke at the beginning, who opened the...
Kavich.
Yes, Kavich, yes, that's right. This is what he's talking about. And I'd like to make a little bit of a correction about what this, since he referred to this particular law of Hammurabi. Let's have a closer look at it. So this is the physician who is using a scalpel, a bronze scalpel, and he's operating on a simum. And a simum is some kind of, usually a skin lesion or a wound. So it's not the kind of surgery where he's taking your appendix out. Huh? Or he's operating on the person's eye, as we had before. And instead of solving the problem, he blinds the person's eye. Huh? Or obviously with the making the incision and the wound or whatever, they got infected and the patient died. So what do? They cut off his hand. Now, let me just say from the very beginning, we never have a single reference anywhere in Mesopotamia before or after Hammurabi to cutting off any physician's hand. It's a very graphic image. If anybody had done any such thing, we would know about it. It would have been mentioned. Remember, we're dealing with a society with these cuneiform tablets where we have about almost, I would say, a grand total of almost 1 million tablets from museums around the world. Huh? I mean, we have a huge amount of documentation. And historical texts and social texts, commentaries and letters, etc. We have lots and lots and lots of different informants about everyday life. Huh? If any doctor's hand would have been cut off for malpractice, we would have known about it. I'm fairly certain when I say this didn't happen. So what does this mean then? The treatment goes wrong, the patient dies, or the man loses his sight. Now, you can see what happens in the next law. If it's on a slave or a mushkenum, then you have to replace the slave with another slave, right? Yeah. Or you pay with silver. So you have monetary value of the slave's life. So again, how much is a person worth? But I have a different interpretation of this idea of cutting off the surgeon's hand or the doctor's hand. And it's very simple. It's this. We have these very nice hemerology texts. That means these are catalogs of lucky and unlucky days of the week, of every month. So almost every day of the month is cataloged, whether it's a lucky day or an unlucky day, and what you're allowed to do on these days. So on some days, you're not allowed to eat pork, and other days you're not allowed to eat onions or garlic, give you bad breath. Other days are lucky days, you're allowed to get married. Other days you're not allowed to get married. So there are all these wonderful texts that we call these hemerologies. Huh? This carries on right into the Middle Ages. We can find these in Europe as well. But in these texts, there's an interesting statement that says, on this day of the month, the doctor is not allowed to reach out his hand to the patient. He's not allowed to touch the patient with his hand. Huh? That's how you describe medical treatment. So I think what we have here is he's not cutting off the doctor's hand. In English, you'd say the doctor is being struck off. That is, he's no longer allowed to operate as a doctor. Now, how do we know who's a doctor in the ancient world? I mean, they don't have diplomas. They didn't have any. You didn't go to a doctor's office where you had a nice framed diploma certificate on the wall saying he studied at Belgrade University Medical School. Nothing like that in the ancient world. So how do we know about a physician's qualifications? So we don't, really. We just assume that this was word of mouth. If someone had a reputation, he healed people, he had a good reputation for healing people, and that's word of mouth spread that he was a good doctor. But in this case, Hammurabi wants to regulate this. If a doctor has really proven to be dangerous to patients, his patients die, or he's causing harm to his patients, as we mentioned in the Hippocratic corpus, then you strike him off. His hand is no longer allowed to be extended to treat patients anymore. And that's how I would understand this passage. But it's very graphic in the way it's phrased, and it's striking, and you remember it. And this is what Hammurabi's code is supposed to do. It's not giving real life punishment. It's to give punishments that you'll remember, that'll stay in your mind, that they're graphic. And I think that's really the point of this kind of information. I don't know whether anybody wants to disagree with me on this, but I think it's a better way and a more humane way, but I think a more accurate way of understanding what's happening in Hammurabi's code. All right. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. If you have no questions. Here we have the physician setting a person's broken bone. I was once in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, and I had a meeting with a physical anthropologist who showed me he had a very large collection of bones, which he collected from ancient sites. Now, this is not normally the case. Normally, archaeologists don't dig up the bones and keep them and study them. But he did, and it was very interesting because he showed me lots and lots of cases as he opened up these drawers full of human bones from these excavations, of cases of broken limbs that had been badly set, that had not been properly repaired. So you'd have an arm, and the arm was broken the bone was broken in the middle, and the rest of the arm went off at a funny angle. Well, obviously, clearly not properly, bones were not properly rejoined together because they didn't really know how to do it. So if you do have, in this case, but they knew that there's, technically speaking, it's something that theoretically should be able to be done, and that's what this law is about. So the Awilum is able to set the broken bone, to heal it, to treat a broken bone, and to get it properly done. And if he does, this is a big event. So it's not worth 10 shekels as we had before with the eyesight, but it's still worth quite a hefty sum of 5 shekels. It shows how relatively important and even unusual this kind of event could be. That's what this high price. And of course, it's less for the mushkenum and it's less for the slave, again. But it's giving us here, again, this is the only time we ever get information about how much the physician is being paid for his services. And it also gives us a little bit of information about the interesting thing about how we're comparing eyesight with the problem of a broken bone in terms of things that are, how can I say, debilitating, relatively debilitating. All right. Okay, let's go on to the next one if we can. Sorry, I just have a message here that I just want to from my computer that wants me to quit some messages so it doesn't suddenly stop working here, All right. Let's hope that solves the problem. Now, here's another one. Here's what I mentioned about the barber and surgery, So really next law in Hammurabi is about the barber. And again, the barber is subject to legal scrutiny in terms of his services. So if the barber tries to disguise the hair coiffure, the hairdo of a slave, so he no longer looks like a slave, and the owner doesn't know about it, so he's really trying to get the he's trying to get the slave to be able to pass for a free person, well, then he's committed an offense. And again, they're cutting off the barber's hand, which I don't believe. We don't cut off people. They didn't cut off people's hands in Mesopotamia, but it means he wouldn't be able to work anymore as a barber, and also then probably as a surgeon. And then it's even more bizarre that you have to hang him in his own doorway, right? But the barber, if he swears, I didn't know anything about this when I operated, that I was doing this, I didn't really realize it was a slave trying to disguise himself, then he can be released. So again, it's trying to help us here in trying to put these professions, healing professions, into some kind of a social context. Okay, so that's really Hammurabi. Let's look at the next slide. Oh yes, this is something which occurs in the Bible again. Two people get into a fight, into a brawl. And what happens is someone wounds somebody else in a brawl, in a fight. So if he says, I didn't strike him intentionally, which means I didn't really mean to hurt him, we just got into a fight. You can find similar things in all systems of law with this kind of situation, right? This is typical kind of civil law torts. But he does have to, it says at the end, Asam Ipal, he has to answer to the physician. In other words, he has to take over the financial responsibility for the treatment. Now again, it's assuming that the Asum deals with these kinds of wounds, which is interesting because we otherwise don't have any information about that, and that you have to pay the Asum for his services. But this is something that's very typical of all legal systems, I think. There's nothing very surprising here. It's only interesting that it occurs in 1800 BC, so early. Okay, let's look at the next one then, Nina. Now, this is also something which you can find in the Bible, and it's got something very surprising in it. We have here, and a Willem strikes a woman of the same class, so the landowning class probably, and she miscarries, right? So he has to deliver 10 shekels of silver. Remember, this 10 shekels of silver was we had paying for the physician for saving somebody's eyesight. It's quite, how much is the baby worth? It's quite a lot of money. But it says, the next law is very surprising. So he strikes the woman and she miscarries and loses her fetus. But if that woman dies, they shall kill his daughter. Now, let's just go to the next one, then we'll come back to this one. If he causes a woman to miscarry by beating her, then he has to pay 5 shekels, right? And if she should die, then he has to deliver 30 shekels. Now, that's quite, all this is interesting, but it doesn't follow very logically. But what I want you to point out here is in each of these cases, remember, we're dealing with these if P then Q formulations, right? If this is the case, then that's the case, even if they don't follow very logically. For instance, in number 210, If the woman should die, they should kill his daughter. Now, first of all, how do we know the man has a daughter? That's the first thing. What happens if he doesn't have any daughters? What happens if he only has sons? Huh? Have I frozen here? Uh-oh.
It's a bit slow. The video is slow on my side, but we can hear you normally. Can you
Can you hear
hear
me?
us?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, it's
Yes, the
my
sound is
computer
normal.
is
The
yeah, my
video is
computer is
just a
not
little
happy for
slow.
some yeah. My computer is not happy for some reason. Let's see if I can it's having a trouble with Firefox. Let's see if I can get rid of some I'm trying to get rid of things so it doesn't it's having trouble with Firefox. I wonder whether I have to go out and come back again.
Well, we can still hear you
Okay. All
normally,
right.
so
Okay. If you
even
have a
if the
problem
video
hearing me,
lags a bit,
all
it's
right.
not a
I
problem.
have this little ball turning around. Okay. Let's see what happens now. Let's hope it. So you'll have to alert me if you can't hear me, huh? Because my screen is frozen. Okay. Well, you
No
can hear me.
problem. Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
I could stop the video. Do you think that would help?
It might if you're having problems on our side, just your video is lagging, but it's not technically a problem. We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, well, I'll see if I can stop the video and that helps. All right, now.
Okay.
The point is, it makes no sense that they killed his daughter. We don't know if he has a daughter. And if he's caused a fetus to miscarry, what does that have to do with his daughter? This punishment doesn't fit the crime in any sense here. Huh? So it's clear that whatever's happening here is either been corrupted or misunderstood, or it's some kind of a and also normally you would say if someone is being punished, you say that person is to be killed. Here they say they kill his daughter. Well, who's they? It doesn't specify who they is. So that is again another problem. Is it the gods? Is it the court? Is it who? Who is it? We don't know. So this is entirely unusual and very difficult to explain. And I think that it's probably here. There may even be some corruption in the text. Huh? But again, we cannot take it literally. What's going on here? Huh? But it's an interesting thing because the idea of someone injuring a woman and she loses her fetus, that is a kind of problem in law, which is a common problem, and it also occurs in biblical texts. So it's a universal kind of situation where you cause secondary damage in a way. So the woman may be fine, but you've caused her to miscarry. Okay, let's go to the next slide. If no questions, let's go to the next slide. Now this is a little small. Can we make this a bit bigger? It's very hard to read this one. Is it possible to enlarge this a little bit more?
I'll try, but I don't know how Acrobat is with zooming.
So this is all about the goring ox. Now, if you can't read it, I can read it out for
I'm
you.
trying to zoom in, but it's doing so very slowly.
Okay, so let's see if I can help. I'll read it out.
No, sorry. It's now loading every slide very slowly, but let's...
I think it may be my Firefox. It says my Firefox is having a problem with for some reason. I'll see what's what, huh? All right.
I don't know about the others. I can read it as it is. So.
Okay, good. All right, let's carry on then. So I'm having the problem is from my computer here. So the goring ox is a standard paradigm in systems of law. Is it not? You have it in Roman law, you have it in the Bible, you have it in the Talmud, you have it everywhere, huh? So the idea is the ox is a paradigm for civil damages. Huh? Why? Because the ox has horns, so it can gore people. It has teeth, it can eat someone's crops. It has hooves, it can trample somebody's crops. And I think there's even a fourth thing which I can't remember. So the ox is the symbol of civil damages. Now, Hammurabi has these provisions about the goring ox, and it's really simple. The provision is, if a man's walking along and some ox comes along and gores him or her, a woman, with their horns, who's responsible? Is the owner of the ox liable for the damages or not? And normally the answer would be no. If it happens in the public thoroughfare and an ox escapes and happens to gore someone with its horns, there's nothing anybody can do about it. However, if this ox is a known ox, that it's been goring people and the owner hasn't done anything about it, then the owner is negligent. And then the owner has to, of course, is liable for the damage of the ox. So this ox, if P, then Q, this is the standard formulation that we see with Hammurabi's code. Now, the standard formulations also appear in omens, in omen texts. And this is what's on the right-hand side of your screen, which I probably have to read to you because it may be too small for you to read. My own screen, it's fine. So these say, this is the kind of information you get in divination, dealing with omens about real life, looking everyday life and looking for omens that what might tell us. Yes, we'll go to the next slide because this one's very slow, but I just want to show that the same principles of legal formulations are then applied to this discipline of divination and forecasting the future with the same kind of formulations. If P, then Q. But in the different, so the formulations are the same, even though the logic is a bit different. All right, let's look at the next slide then. Now, here is the interesting question. And this is the legal question, which you, as legal experts, have to help decide. Now, in this language, Akkadian language, there is a big difference between what we call the preterite form, the past tense form, and the future forms of the verbs. So in the if P clause, it'll usually say if something happened, and it uses the form of the verb which we say is the preterite. It's in the past. If something happened, then something else will happen. Now, from a legal point of view, the jurists like this idea of will because they like things to be very precise and predictive in a way that everybody can understand. If such and such happens, then something will happen, right? So if someone murders somebody, he will be executed. Very nice. On the other hand, we know that in real life there are lots and lots of extenuating circumstances and reasons that things happen. And actually, in the formulation, even in Hammurabi's code, we don't have to translate it as will happen, because these forms of these future verbs in Akkadian can mean could happen, or should happen, or may happen, or would, under the right circumstances, happen. Not will, not necessarily will. So it really depends on your point of view, whether you're coming from this as a legal point of view, or whether you're looking at this from this logic of these omens, like we had before. If an ox eats a man's shoe, then his wife will die. Well, it doesn't mean his wife will die. It means his wife may die. Why? Not because the ox ate the man's shoe, but the act of eating the man's shoe was an omen. This was a sign that something bad might happen in the household. It's an unusual event. The ox eats someone's shoe. So is that a good omen or a bad omen? Well, that could be a bad omen because it might mean that someone in his household could die. But that's could, should, would, not necessarily will. And it's not causation. See, it's not, the wife isn't dying because the ox ate the shoe. It's only that the ox ate the shoe as an omen of what could happen in the household. And this is very important to understand this ancient logic here, that it's association of ideas. It's not causality. It's not because of being caused to do it. So are we clear? So this is a very important principle that we may need to discuss in terms of the difference between law and these other disciplines. Can we look at the next slide? So this theory of P and Q is very interesting, and it's been discussed in an important essay here from 2009 by Francesca Rochberg called Science in Context. If you're interested, she has a very clear way of explaining this logic of these conditionals, inference, possibility in science, but she also refers to these legal paradigms. So, because legal paradigms are the first, and they're the most concrete, the ones we understand the best. So we use those as the starting point for this if P then Q, but then we see how it's applied to all the many other disciplines. Now let's go on a little bit further. How much longer should I can stop any time, Nina, for discussion. Should I go just for a few more minutes, huh?
Feel free to wrap up at the pace you wanted, and we'll just extend for a few more minutes due to the technical problems. So no
That's
problem.
right. I just want.
Yeah, I've been taking some notes for questions, but
oh, good. All right. Okay, I'll just have a couple more interesting things, and then we'll stop. Sometimes this logic of if P then Q can even be impossible things. It doesn't matter, because the idea was to include all possibilities, theoretical ones as well. So here you have, if the sun appears in the evening watch, or the night is divided into three different sections, evening, middle watch, and morning watch. Well, if you have the sun, how can you have the sun in the middle of the night? You can't, of course. So these are, even with these if P then Q clauses, you can even include things that you know are impossible, but it doesn't matter. It's all part of this idea of cataloging all possibilities. Let's just look one more slide and we'll see, and then this is just an historical omen. It just shows how literally these things could be, because the king of Assyria asked his scholars about what can happen about his rival, and whether he's going to, whether it's a good idea to try to conquer him, and the rivals tell him, no, the omens are unfavorable, you better not get involved. Someone should have told Vladimir Putin about these as well. Perhaps we would have a different result today if he'd had the right kind of advisors. But it just shows you now that this kind of transfer of this if P then Q paradigm, and how it follows through in many other circumstances. I have more slides here about physiognomic omens, etc., but I don't think it's necessary. I think we can already draw the subject to a close, and we can see how we can deal with the kind of questions that are being raised here, and we can refer to these later on if we need to for more examples. Okay, let's perhaps stop here and see what we can.
Thank you very much, Professor. So now I'm opening the discussion. I can share the slides again if they are needed for reference at some point. So does anyone have any questions or comments? I do, but I would be happy if any students or anyone else attending had any questions first. So feel free to either turn on your camera or at least microphone and ask questions orally, or if you can't do that, feel free to type the questions in the chat. Igor Mojdrag has a question. Igor, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, first of all, for your time. I would like to ask, you said that a lot of the cases did not match the Hammurabi law. So is that only for, let's say, laws that have a certain sanction, or even for these positive ones that are not going to affect anyone in a way, that are just regular rules, so to say?
So these are court cases. So, someone's disputing about the inheritance of a slave. Someone died, he had slaves. How's the property going to be distributed among the heirs? You see, who inherits, that kind of thing. People get to do, or there's a divorce and the property has to be divided. What is the wife going to get, etc. This is the typical kind of thing we get in court cases. So often, usually property law, that kind of thing. We don't get many criminal cases. There's not many cases of that, so it would be, but mostly kind of disputes. And in these cases, the judge gives a ruling, and the ruling seems to be what the judge thinks is best, is fairest. And there's never any reference to this is what Hammurabi says on the subject. You see, so I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's,
Yeah, it does. It does. Thank
that's
you.
the general pattern that we see.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Poloyets has a question.
Please.
Thank you. It is also something in connection for the with the previous question. You said that Hammurabi Code is more theoretical, and so that it is not used really in court cases. And so you at the beginning also mentioned digest of Justinian and
Yes.
whether it can be compared or not. So I would like to say that in this case, I don't think we have a lot of evidence about court cases, but I can say something how these rules, I said, I was talking about some of these abstract rules, how they were formulated. It is in fact they came from in fact from practice. You know, for example, it is another way around. First, there were practical cases, and then the rule was formulated. For example, I mentioned this rule, liberum corpus nullam recipit estimationem, so that the body of the free man is not capable of estimation in money. It is in fact about specific cases when animal takes free man and he was wounded, and another case when something was thrown out of the building and wounds free men. And in these cases, then at the end of this we have this casuistic manner in the digest. We have this rule. So then, and at the end, it became universal. So this is, I think, the different way these rules were formulated. And also, because I didn't have time to explain more, but it is a civil liability. It is liability for damage because you cannot ask for damage if somebody free body is wounded. But for the punishment, it is another thing. Of course, there is a higher penalty if there is a penalty in terms of criminal, I say criminal law, let's say, if of course Freeman is killed or wounded. This is my observation. And may I say, now maybe also have something about this Goring Ox, because I also was interested in these cases. You said this is civil liability, universal for Hammurabi, and also Bible, yes, law from the Bible, Moses legislation. It's interesting, we also have these provisions in our nomocanon code from the 13th century. But you know, there is also a very big difference, because if ox gores a man in a Hammurabi case, then in fact there is no liability of owner except that if he knows for that. But in a Bible, this ox is stoned in the same situation.
Yeah.
And in Roman law, if two ox, for example, then there is not this exactly this case, but there is another case when two oxes or bulls, yes, fight together. Then it is important to know which one starts fight, and so the aggressor will be not the owner of the aggressor is liable, so he can extradite this ox to the to another owner. So it is also interesting to compare these different. So I also have some more interesting. There are many interesting cases to compare. For example, Barber's case. You mentioned Barber. In Roman law, there is very interesting case when Barber was shaving a slave, and then somebody hit a ball, and then ball fell on the barber's hand, and then barber cut a throw of slaves. So who is guilty? Whether him or barber. So, well, these are maybe more comments than questions, but they include also questions. So maybe you can say again something.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
here, this is,
Sorry.
you raise really, you raise very, very interesting issues. And the question is, do these law codes really represent a collection of individual cases where you then you create general rules based on experience, or are they theoretical without really much reference to what actually happens in the law courts? It's ideal in the sense this is what we like, this is what we think the law should be like, in a very theoretical way, not with any real pretense of having anything to do with the realities of law. And so the goring ox is a good example. This is a paradigm of what liabilities, a simple way of creating an image of liability and explaining it in an easy way that everybody can understand, in a sort of graphic way. Who is ultimately responsible for what the ox does? So stoning the ox is probably the silliest thing, because, well, it's not the ox's fault, but it means that the owner of the ox loses a very valuable asset by allowing his ox. So, but of course, these are all culture specific. They change over time. Every society has slightly different variations on it. And of course, in Roman law, the thinking is much more advanced in many ways. After 2,000 years of experience of law, people learn something in the end. But let me give you an example from medicine that might be relevant to your question. Can we go back, Nina, to the presentation, or to the end of the presentation? Because I want to show you something from medicine that might help. If we can share the screen again. Yes, yes, this is what I want to look at. Now, this is the same kind of formulation, if P then Q. I hope you can read it. I hope it's large enough. These are symptoms, medical symptoms, and you see how they're formulated in the same way as the Hammurabi's code. If something happens, then something happens. So if a person's forehead has fever, he may get well. If his forehead is cold, he may get well. But if his forehead is white and his tongue is white, his illness may be prolonged, but he'll get well. If his forehead is white but he has some craving for food on the same day, and etc. So these are, if its forehead is red, if it's yellow, these are all different kinds of situations where we have symptoms of disease. Now, the way this book is organized, this handbook, there are some 3,000 symptoms here, and it's organized from head to foot. Now, for modern physicians, this isn't very helpful because we want to know what are the symptoms of a patient. Huh? This patient suffers from this, we want to know their symptoms. Or maybe symptoms of a disease and symptoms. These are the disease of, this is what the symptoms are of I don't know, epilepsy or something. And the symptoms are this and this and this and this. This handbook takes all the symptoms according to parts of the body, starting at the head, going down to the foot. You see all the symptoms of the head, all the neck, chest, etc., all the way down. So the diseases are all scattered among all of these symptoms, because you can have a disease can have some symptoms in the head. You can have fever. You can have yellow eyes. You can be coughing. You can have sore stomach. You can have diarrhea. All these can be symptoms of a disease, but they're spread all through this text. And people try to reconstruct ancient diseases from this text. What did people think of as disease in this ancient Mesopotamia? But there's a problem here, and when they try to do that, they don't understand that these symptoms are not based on any one case, any one patient. So it looks like casuistic case law, if such and such a case, this might be the case. But these are really descriptions of disease, not patients. So there may be 50 patients having these symptoms in any one of these cases. These aren't individual sick persons. These are descriptions of illnesses, of situations. The forehead is yellow, the person may ask for pomegranate, as you see in line 134. So they can be very specific, but it doesn't mean that it's only refers to a single person. This is a pattern of the disease, what can happen in the disease. So this is the way of thinking about it. It becomes very confusing, of course, for us if you're trying to identify what the diseases are. It doesn't help us very much, but for them, this was a nice textbook. If you're a doctor and you want to find out about what your patient might, what symptoms might have, well, it's very well organized from head to foot. You can go all the way down from head to foot, and you can see what typical symptoms look like for this patient. So it's a reference book useful for them, not useful for us. But with disease, this is something that you can really see. You see a person has fever and has other symptoms. You can see this person might die. It may not last very long. In 3 days from now, that person will be dead. So it's something that a physician with a little bit of practice could probably be pretty good at predicting. He could know what's going to happen, but not on the basis of any single patient. So this is our problem in these legal cases as well. Are they based on a single case, which then a number of single individual cases, which then become incorporated into a code? Or is the code simply a description of crimes or situations or legal arguments or legal disputes, in a kind of general sense? That's the problem, I think, that we face here in trying to understand this kind of information. Does that help address your question?
I can only say that in Roman law is obviously the other way around. So we are not, we don't have such a problem because it really came from, although we don't know exactly whether these cases existed or not, but because of these jurists who were working as practitioners, so they formulated these cases in the practice, and then these rules were later on formulated as a general. So we have different technique from Hammurabi's code, in fact.
It's important to see how things change and develop over time. That's also very important. We can't assume that everything remains the same, that we would expect that legal thinking develops over time.
But this Hammurabi style is more similar to our present day
Yes, funny.
formulation.
Yes.
I think so. It is then it is a bit so it is specific. It's more like a English system
Yes.
precedents.
Yes, which is funny. Huh? That's right. Which is very,
Yes.
yes. Anyway, thank you very much.
If it's all right, I'd also like to ask and comment a few things. First,
Please.
to add something to this last discussion, uh, as far as I know, there are essentially two basic, let's say, theories of what ancient legislators do, and not just ancient, pre-modern, let's say, ancient and medieval. And the Romans might be an exception, but because of what Professor Poloyats already explained, but more or less everyone else. So there's first the theory of the typical case, and that's what connects really well to what you said about the medicine and the numbers of patients that must have gone into the descriptions in the medical textbook. So also old legislators simply legislate about the typical cases. An example that comes to my mind from medieval Serbia, because that's my main area of expertise, is when the death penalty is pronounced for a murder in the closest family. And the law says who kills his father, mother, brother, or child. So only the sister of the closest relatives is missing, and that's because normally a sister doesn't live with you in the same house. She is married and lives with her husband. So your parents, your brothers, and your children would live with you, but your sister wouldn't. And that's simply the typical household. Of course, technically the sister could still live there, but the exceptions are not so interesting. And then the other possibility, which could of course appear in the same code if necessary, is that of a precedent, more or less, not necessarily in the common law sense that as a binding judicial precedent, but of an individual case that happened at some point and that got codified. And when we see something very unusual in a law, that might be an indicator that it was some individual case or small number of cases. So in most legal systems, we don't have, like in Roman law, lawyers sitting and thinking up the most unusual combinations, like, oh, and what would we do in this case? So probably something like that happened in practice, and the judge was thinking, oh my God, what should I do with this? And after that, the lawgiver decided to put it in the code for future reference if something like that happens ever again. I don't know what do you think about this?
So we don't have any evidence of precedent law in Mesopotamia. Not that we know of. Huh? We don't see it working in the other way around, that you have a case, it's interesting, and then it becomes incorporated into a legal code. As far as we can tell, there's no evidence of this. Huh? But it's obviously one of the important ways in which legal laws work, this idea of jurists work, this idea of precedents. Huh? But it may be something which was a product, a result of experience over time, huh? As law becomes more and more developed. And things, the most important thing is that things change over time. Huh? People learn, huh? Societies learn and they develop. Huh? So, and it's the changes and the developments which is really important to see how these laws change. That's why I think the history of law is so interesting, because we can see these developments. But in the case of what we have here is the way that legal reasoning becomes universal in terms of other disciplines as well. That is really the crucial point. And we don't have this in the West because Aristotle developed new ways of logic, and this was then discarded in terms of other kinds of logical processes. So by the time we get to the Greeks, it stops, and then it doesn't come any longer into Western ways of thinking about law and other topics. Huh? We have philosophy then, and we have other kinds of ways of thinking about science. Huh? So that's really the important difference here.
And if I may, I also wanted to raise some questions regarding the penalties in Hammurabi's code and the examples that you've been showing us. First of all, I find this really interesting what you've said about the possibility that it's not literally physically cutting off the doctor's and the barber's hand. But on the other hand, we do have very strict penalties in Hammurabi's code, not just lots of death penalty, but we do have the provisions for physical injuries, where if someone cuts off an Avalum's hand, his hand should also be cut off.
These were all allegories. We don't have any evidence of anybody being physically tortured or cut or anything like this. There is simply not a single shred of evidence anywhere.
I understand that, but do you think it was Hammurabi just trying to scare people off by threatening to cut off their hands?
I think that's what the idea was, yes.
Okay,
to make these things so easily memorable. It's something that's a graphic image that you wouldn't forget, but nobody took it seriously.
Well,
Everybody
there are
understood.
examples of similar approaches in some other laws. Again, in my area in medieval Serbia, Dušan's code, completely different situation, mid-14th century, but he also introduces lots of death penalties and cutting off of hands mostly, and other mutilation punishments, and we don't have any records of those being used in practice. Although we don't have many records from practice generally because the Ottoman conquest destroyed more or less everything. So,
but I think this is a kind of, it's a kind of almost like public relations. It's a gimmick.
Well, yes,
to make the law being taken seriously. That this is
my point being, in the case of the physician, we can presume that cut off his hand is meant as a metaphor, let him not extend his hand to the patient, let him be barred from practicing medicine.
I think that's
but in the case of just an injury, if someone cuts off an Avalum's hand, cut off his hand, I can't
think these
think
were
of
monetary. These were monetary. They were monetary penalties that were fines. Yes.
You think it just stayed monetary in practice?
I think so. That this is what it was worth, and this is what the compensation was, as far as we can tell. In other later periods, the monetary compensation was standard. Nobody was having their hands being intentionally. There was no procedure for this. There was no mechanism for this. There's no record of this. The courts wouldn't. There would be no way that this kind of thing would be carried out, that we have even the slightest indication of. So I think we have to think about these things differently. I think that's the point.
That's interesting. And regarding the prices of the fees, of course, in practically every ancient and medieval document, we have some sort of estate inequality, difference in status when it comes to punishing for a crime against a nobleman or a commoner and so on. So that there's nothing unusual in that. But what strikes me as interesting is the difference in fees. So because in some laws we also have what seems like a reverse logic, when a fine is paid for a crime, that people of higher status pay higher fines. And the logic is they are richer, they can pay more. So maybe that could also be seen in these provisions, because the Avilum can afford to pay 10 shekels for a life-saving procedure, and if you ask the Mushken to pay that much, maybe he simply can't afford it.
No, I think that's absolutely
sell
correct.
His house or something. So
that's absolutely correct. I think that's right. So the fees are tailored to the ability to pay, and that's a very interesting kind of social comment. Very interesting social comment. Yes. Right. Right. So have we had enough fun for one morning?
Well, we probably have. I don't see any more hands raised.
Right.
Last chance if anyone has a question. If not, thank you very much, Professor Geller. This
Thank
was
you for
very
inviting me. It was great.
interesting.
It was great fun. I enjoyed this very much.
Thank you. I hope we'll have a chance to invite you to come to Belgrade in person in the future.
With pleasure. That would be a great pleasure.
Thank you very much. So everyone else, we're taking a short break now, 10 minutes, and then we're moving on to our first student.
Sorry, I have another seminar, so I can't join you for your next sessions.
Good luck on your seminar, and
Thank you
see
very
you
much.
some other time.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye-bye.